Hey folks, I wanted to continue our study of John a bit. We left off, we were in John 2. Um, Currently our section is John 2, 13 to 17. And what happened just before this is Jesus was at he was at a wedding, and he turned the water into wine. And after the wedding, he went to Capernaum with his mother and his brothers and his disciples and had, as best as we can tell, a brief little vacation. And so what's come up is now it's just about Passover. And Passover for the Jewish folks was this really big deal. Everybody had to come to Jerusalem. If you were a Jewish person and you wanted to stick to tradition and you wanted to follow what your faith was asking of you, you needed to do sacrifices. But the only place that the sacrifices were allowed to happen is at the temple. So that meant you had people coming from Africa and all over the place, traveling really far to come back and practice their faith. This one time a year, they would all make a pilgrimage there. So the place is overcrowded. There's too many people in Jerusalem at this time, and the city's just bursting at its seams. And they do this every year for Passover. So what Jesus does is he goes to town and he walks into the temple, and generally the entrance was on the east side, and it's actually he probably walked through the same gates, the triumphal entry later. But he goes through, and as soon as you come in, you're in this courtyard. It's pretty big. This is a big courtyard, but it's walled in, and it's part of the temple. They called it the court of the Gentiles, or the outer court. And it was still, because it was part of the temple, it was holy and it was sacred. But it was the only place that the Gentiles were allowed to worship. If they were to try to go deeper into the temple, they're actually committing a crime, and there's these big signs posted that say, no Gentiles past this point. And if a Gentile would go past that point and go deeper into the temple, the consequence of that was death. And it was such a big deal to the Jewish people that the Roman government allowed it and said, okay, even a Roman citizen, if you go into the court, if you go past the court of the Gentiles, then you'll be put to death. So this story takes place in the outer court, in the court of the Gentiles. And it was common when you hear, other stories of Jesus being in the temple, there was probably things being sold then too. But as you might imagine, the court of the Gentiles is a place where anybody could be, whether they had that faith or not. And so the merchants would set up shop there. And you have people that are supposed to sacrifice specific animals that are coming into town from all kinds of places. And it would have been really difficult to bring those animals with them. And so the merchants have set up shop to sell the animals that they need for really, really exorbitant prices. Think Disney World here. Like if you're going to pay $20 for a Coke when you're in Disney, imagine if it wasn't a Coke if you're buying a sheep or a cow. These are really expensive animals, and it's people taking advantage of people that have traveled really far. Well, you don't just have that happening, you also have these money exchangers. And what they've done is the local merchants will only accept local currency. So everybody that's traveling from somewhere else, they don't have local currency, they have currency from where they're from. And so the money exchangers are charging a really high price for people to change their money over to a currency that will actually be accepted. And so, again, these people from out of town are really being taken advantage of. And Jesus sees this. And I can't say that he was angry. It doesn't say he was angry. There's another place in the Bible where it uses that term. But I feel like it's fair to say he was clearly upset. And what the Bible does say is that he was zealous. But I think you have to look at that in context, and that he was zealous for justice. He wanted justice to be happening. And he picks up these cords, and he starts to make a whip out of them. And the cords were probably by the cattle. They were probably the same cords they would use to lead the cattle to slaughter. So he probably goes over there and he picks up some of the cords, and he starts, braiding them together, or makes himself a whip. The Greek is really clear here, because people use this, as he uses this whip, people use this to say, oh yeah, even Jesus was violent. In the appropriate setting, violence is appropriate. I don't think you could say that, because the Greek is the language is really specific about what's the subject and what's the object. And when you look at the Greek, it's very clear that he used the whip on the cattle and the sheep. And that would have been normal. That was how you would get cattle and sheep to move from one place to another. That was, you would use a whip and they move on. And so it says that he used that on the cattle and sheep to drive them out of the temple. Well, if you're the people who own the cattle and sheep, I imagine you're probably going with them because you're trying to gather them together yourself, because that's your money. That's your livelihood. And so they were probably driven out too, but they weren't hit with whips. And I think that's an important distinction, because we can't use this verse, we can't use this little story to justify violence, even in a social justice setting. That's just not what happened here. So anyway, he uses the whip, and drives out the cattle and the sheep. And then he looks to those that were selling. Well, before he looks to those that were selling the doves, he actually turns over the tables. And so the money exchangers, he turns over the tables and spreads the change all over. And so again, if your job is to exchange money, you've got all of these different currencies laid out. You probably have a nice little system. It doesn't say he picked up the money and threw it to the crowds. He wasn't stealing from people, but he did create a scene. There's no doubt about that. And he created work for people, and social justice is happening here. I don't want to make this sound calmer than it was. Jesus did something crazy here. He really pushed the envelope. But he didn't hurt people, and he didn't steal from people. And so we can't use this to justify those two things. But he spreads the money out, and so you imagine that those that are doing the money exchange are gathering up their stuff and trying to sort through and figure out what coin goes to what, and trying to get themselves together again. And then he looks to those that are selling the doves, and doves would have been the sacrifice that those with the least amount of money, they would have been buying doves. And so I don't doubt that they were still exorbitant prices, but they wouldn't have been on par with the amount of money that the other people were making. And so he then looks to them and says, "Get out of here. This isn't a place to sell." And he says, I think he addresses everybody at this point and says, "Don't make my Father's house a market." And what the scriptures then say is, it says that his disciples were reminded about a psalm. And it's this little section in Psalm 69 that says, I will be consumed with zealousy for my Father's house, or something like that. I'm probably getting that wrong, but in the context of Psalm 69, when you read it, that's what it's saying. It's this big mourning poem or song, really powerful. I can't go into it here because it would get me completely sidetracked. But it's a really cool psalm, and I would suggest reading it in parallel with reading this section of John 2. Don't just read one without reading the other. They go together. You need to be able to read both of them. So that's where we end, because we're stopping at 17. There's more to the story, but it's got to be covered in another one. So you're really just left with application here. What do you do with this verse? Well, we've got Jesus who's acting in a social justice way, and he does it with nonviolence. And so that I think he's showing us something to mimic there. And for me personally, what I find as I look at the scripture is I have to evaluate my own life. And what I notice is that there's very little that I'm that zealous about, that I care for justice enough. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a social worker. I work in foster care. I work for my local church. Like I am involved in social justice in various ways. But I don't have that kind of passion. I have passion that drives me every single day, but nothing that gets me that worked up that I'm willing to make a scene over. I get worked up. I get mad about things that happen to my kids, but I don't often make a scene. I don't ever make a scene. And so I look at this little story, and I have to evaluate myself and determine, like, how do I create that in myself or allow God to create in me this desire for justice that's so strong that I'm willing to make a scene. This isn't the only story in the Bible where somebody is consumed with jealousy or a desire for justice, and they make a scene because of that. It's not even close to the only story like that. And we read over them and we think, oh yeah, that's a great story. But how often do we really reflect and think, what gets us that way? For me, not much. And that scares me a little bit. I should be a little more zealous. Again, at the same time, I want to caution that righteous zealot or righteous justice and being passionate about these things is not the same thing as violent, aggressive, lashing out. I think there's a lot of stuff that's happening now, and on one side, I don't want to encourage people to lay down and let it happen without saying anything. We need to be speaking truth into these situations. But on the other, I think the line stops at violence or aggression. We can't be that. If we're that, then we're fighting bad things with bad things, and we're not going to get anywhere. But are we fighting? Are we speaking truth into the world, or are we just sitting by? So I enjoyed it. I hope you do as well, and I hope it encourages you to take a step in the right direction and do something and speak up and speak truth into the world. Thanks.